Hey there, this is Della Rucker, principal of the Wise Economy Workshop. Thank you so much for joining me here today for my very first Ask Me Anything. So we're going to see what happens here. I don't know what kind of questions I'm going to get. I've got a couple that I've gotten ahead of time. So I figure we'll give this about half an hour. We'll see what it looks like and how fun it is, and anything's on the table. I might choose not to answer certain questions, but we'll let it go for there. All right. So I should be able to see comments as we're talking today, and so I'm gonna start with a couple that got sent in to me ahead of time, and I'm going to take these are in no particular order. We'll see. So one of the first questions that somebody sent me, which I thought was kind of like a little bit crazy, was they asked me who my favorite authors are. I thought that was a really fun and for me a little bit easier way to get started than some of the like super heavy questions that have come in, which are super important, but give me a chance to work into this a little bit. So they asked me about my favorite authors, and I really have two that I go back to over and over and over again, and a few others that I touch occasionally. So one of my favorite, probably my favorite novelist is Alan Paton. And some of you who are older may know Alan Paton from the book Cry the Beloved Country. I'll say it more slowly. Cry the Beloved Country. And Cry the Beloved Country is a novel written about the experience of apartheid in South Africa I believe it's set in the 1950s, and it's based on his personal experience. Peyton was he was white. He was from a relatively comfortable background, but he ended up being a school teacher, and a really sort of revolutionary school teacher in a prison for youth in South Africa during the early years of the actual institution of apartheid. He was also involved in politics. So he's kind of an amazing figure to me, who kind of crosses the boundary between being an unbelievably beautiful, incredible author to really a doer. He was one of the organizers of one of the first opposition parties that was actually eliminated by law under apartheid. So I love him for a couple of different reasons. One is that his writing is just stunning. It is so beautiful. He captures somehow on the written page, he captures the lyricality, the lyricalness of the accent of people who lived in that culture at that time. And it's just stunningly gorgeous writing. The other thing that's so cool to me about him is that he really kind of lived on both sides of this line that I've struggled with myself all through my career, which is wanting to be a writer, wanting to, be the creator of art and beauty, and connect to people's emotions, and do the work that you can do through beautiful written language. At the same time, he was actually he was making fairly significant impact on that country in that time period. So he, to me, is just, both an incredible writer and an incredible human. And I really look for people that have that combination. Another one who falls into that same category is Lewis Thomas, who was actually a doctor. And he wrote about kind of medical issues, but also about science and the future and culture. He was a columnist, I believe, for the New Yorker for many, many years through the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I didn't discover him until much later. But the combination of technical knowledge and the ability to write about it so lyrically, so beautifully, he blows me out of the water even now, years later. The third one, and it's ironic, and I don't quite know what to do with it, that they're all three of these are male types, and I'm like definitely not. But the third one is Mike Royko, who was a columnist for the Chicago Tribune in the 60s through most of the 90s. And, Royko was like as a human being, you would think he was extremely different from me. He was a heavy cigarette smoker, heavy drinker, very gruff, tough kind of persona. And he wrote a column every day, 5 days a week for most of several decades. And, so his output is just unbelievably prodigious. And because he has such enormous output, some of them, at least from the perspective of a non-native Chicagoan, and now many years later, some of them kind of feel a little bit clunky. But consistently, what he does is so amazing in terms of just the strength and the beauty of what he writes. So that was a little bit of a long answer on a relatively simple question. But, I am an ex-English teacher. I think some of you know that. One of my first careers, depends on how you pick, was as an English teacher. So I can go on this kind of thing all day. I love good writing. So that's cool. Okay, that one I'm going to ask. Somebody else asked me about professional certifications. So part of what how I have marketed myself over the last many years is that I have professional certifications in both planning and in economic development. So if you're a planner, I have an AICP, which is the certification of the American Institute of Certified Planners. On the economic development side, I have a CECD, or sometimes it's pronounced CXD, and that's the one of several certifications, but a lot of times it's considered kind of like I don't know if it's the gold standard, but like the main one for economic developers. And I carry both of those, and I've carried both of those for something like 10 years now. Probably, it's more than 10 years, actually. Don't do the math. I could tell you that I got my AICP when my son, Jonathan, who is now 19, was a baby, and I had to take a breast pump with me to take the AICP exam. The CFD I did a little bit later, but so it's been a while. So the person asked, should I get these kind of certifications? And my answer, really, I'm going to be very generic about this. I think it really depends on what you want to do and what your priorities are for yourself. In my case, I've maintained both of those all this time, in part because once you've got them, it's it's a lot of work. You don't want to give it up again. But in my case, it became an easy way to say, and kind of a shortcut to being able to say, I have expertise on this side and I have expertise on that side. Now, my expertise may not really be all that deep, and certainly doesn't include a lot of things. So I was on a call talking to a class about micromobility a little bit earlier today. And, I know what an e-scooter is. I know what a bike share is. There's stuff I know, but it was great that there were other people on there that were much more knowledgeable about how that stuff works than me, because that ain't my cup of tea. So it was having those certifications, in my case, is a kind of a shortcut way to demonstrate expertise. I don't have to talk to you for 20 minutes for you to get that message. On the other hand, that and a $1.50 gets me a cup of coffee, right? So it may not necessarily be the most, it may not be that valuable in all contexts. Certainly if you're job hunting, in planning, in a lot of places, having an AICP makes you much more qualified as a professional. And sometimes you'll see that they, in a job listing, they'll specify AICP required or AICP preferred, words preferred. But when it comes to economic development, there's multiple certifications. And frankly, the CFD can be pretty hard to get. So a lot of people find it easier and more relevant to what they're interested in to get an EDFP, which is the basically the finance certification, or something else like that. So I think it really depends a lot on what it is that you're trying to achieve. Ooh, that's a cool one. All right, I'm gonna take that from Josie. So this person is responding to the fact that that I talk a lot anymore about racial equity, social equity. A lot of you know that I'm heavily involved in a couple of different organizations that are about predominantly African American homeownership. Not homeownership, sorry. It has already been a long day and it's like, what, noon? Entrepreneurship. Let's go with that one. We were talking homeownership on the other thing. So the ability to do, to start a business, if you are coming from a low income background, particularly if you're coming from an African American background, and there's a whole host of barriers to that. If you want to learn more about that, I would strongly recommend a report called The Tapestry of Black Business in America by the Association for Enterprise Opportunity. So that's far and away the best, and it's incredibly accessible. They did such a good job on this thing. So the information's great, and it's incredibly, like, you really get your head around it in a big hurry. But the question she asked was, how can I be a good ally? And I'm assuming by that she means to African American, minority, etc., people in whatever context. And I think the most important thing, that's a topic that we could have a long conversation about. But I think what I have found to be the most important roles, and I fail as an ally, it's an aspiration, right? And we don't always do it well. Sometimes we really screw it up. But I have found that being a good ally to my African American and minority colleagues, friends, etc., really means that I have to do three things. One is that I don't assume that my worldview is the only worldview. So I sometimes have to really stop and really, really pull back on responding. And I have to work really hard on listening and on being aware of the context that another person is coming from. What do they assume is normal behavior? What do they assume is the right way to approach a particular question? And I really have to put my own assumptions on that in the back seat and say, I thought it was this way, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I could very well be wrong in this context. So that stepping back kind of and listening is a really important piece. The other thing is that I try super hard to put myself in the background. And that's hard because I have a massive, massive ego. But becoming a good ally means that I have to make sure that the people who live the experience are the ones who are front and center. And in most cases, that's not me. And for some people, that's a really big challenge. I've been doing it for long enough now that I hope that I do it fairly well sometimes. But it also means that I have to really step back and be very conscious of where I am. And the third thing is that I have to be very, very careful of my own perceived or real expertise. So with Trap House, which I've mentioned before, I'm preparing a lot of materials. I'm doing a lot of the writing because I write very easily. It's super easy for me to, I mean, super easy is a relative term. I still have to work at it. But compared to somebody who really struggles with writing, it's very easy for me to turn out a document explaining X, Y, or Z, you know, a business document or a pitch or something like that. But I have to, because I'm perceived as an expert in a lot of these spaces, it's going to be assumed that, well, I shouldn't, you know, somebody else may presume that I shouldn't challenge her because she's the quote unquote expert. And so I have to be really, really, really explicit sometimes about saying, I might have this wrong. I might not be describing this right. Take the red pen to this. And the term I often use with the folks I work with is rip this the hell up. You know, do not hold back on me because you assume that I'm the expert, because I'm probably not the expert on the things in this context that you are. So rip it the hell up. And that's super important, is that we have to be able to take sometimes very pointed, very sharp, very difficult feedback and not make it about us. I think that's the main thing, is that when you are a person of privilege, you're used to it all being about you. It's you know, you're used to being the center of attention. You're used to being the one that other people are catering to. But if we're going to be a good ally, if we're going to really advance our objectives with regard to racial equity and advancement of people who don't look like us, then we really have to be taking ourselves out of the equation. We really have to be stepping into a support environment. And again, I think that's a learned skill for a lot of people. And it's one of those situations where we default back to what we knew before very, very easily. And if we're not really conscious about stepping back, then we're not going to be very good allies, and we're probably going to screw it up. So thank you. That's one that I really like to talk about. So I really appreciate it. Let's see, so. Sorry, I gotta take a peek here. I'm getting comments from multiple places. So if you don't see what I'm looking at, that's just because somebody made the comment on a different platform. This is going to multiple platforms at the same time. So this question is asking for advice on getting, and I can't tell whether, let me know if you're working in government or you're just like a citizen, or kind of what your relationship to the government is, if you would, please. Amy? Yeah. Okay. So the question here, and this is a super hard one, and I was kind of afraid that somebody would say this. The question is, my government, my local leadership is not being very progressive. They're not really seeing the kind of challenges that you've been talking about. And I think by that she's referring to the things that I've been talking about in the live stream, some of the readings, some of the stuff about futurism and how the world is changing at a macro level and at a level that we can't necessarily control. And I liken it sometimes to the tide coming in, and that how that is already impacting and will impact our local communities. And the question that Amy is raising is, my leadership is not getting that, and how do I get them to see the light, essentially? And that's super hard. So as I've thought about this, there's it's really a communications challenge, and it's a challenge of dealing with the fact that we don't really want to change. We don't want new information, and sometimes we find that kind of nerve-wracking, especially if we're in a position of responsibility to the current system. So this is the best object example I've seen of making this kind of transition. And this was actually done, if you go back on my podcast on building a wise local economy on Stitcher or Spotify or Apple iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, or on SoundCloud, which is where it's all hosted originally. If you go back a few years, you may find an interview with the city of Dublin, Ohio. And I tell the story that I wasn't too excited about doing that interview to begin with. I was kind of doing it as a favor to a friend of mine, because Dublin is a pretty privileged community, and I was like, okay, well, anything they do in Dublin is not going to be relevant to a whole lot of other places. And I was completely wrong. So this is about 7-8 years ago. Dublin was trying to get ready to do some pretty substantial changes to its historic downtown area as a means of, addressing some of the demographic changes, some of the workforce changes that they were already seeing happen in that time period. But they knew that this was going to be pretty radical, and that it was going to be kind of a shocker to people in their community, and that there would likely be some pretty strong opposition unless they really got the leadership of the community, and by this I mean writ large, not just the political leadership, because obviously who are they listening to, at least we hope. And they went through a series over the course of several months of having speakers, having presentations, having information given to the community, made available to the community, that got into the kinds of demographic changes and demographic projections that they were looking at, that was digging more deeply into what younger generations were looking for in the places where they wanted to live and work and play and the like. And it was that information made it very clear that existing Dublin was not really what they were looking for in a lot of cases. And so they went through that process, and I'm sure it had to cost them some money, but it also took some time. And they really worked through a process of educating and discussing, again, not just with their political leadership, but with people who were, active citizens involved with nonprofits, leaders in education, et cetera, et cetera. So they were really trying to get to some of the people who have an audience of their own that they're talking to. And as a result of that, they were able to really move the needle. And this is the government doing this. This is the city government. But they were able to move the needle of popular thinking, and they were able to really educate people rather broadly on what this new context looked like. And as a result of that, when they began to talk about changes to the physical environment, it was really much less combative than what a lot of us are used to seeing in communities. The call I was just on now, one of the city planners told a story of a time where she was asked to leave a meeting over a reconfiguring of parking spaces. Obviously, that was, something happened, and for whatever reason, that was a scary prospect for the people involved, and they didn't react to it in a very, positive and rational sort of way. The process that Dublin went through, that you can kind of hear described firsthand in that podcast, really made for a very different experience. So I hope that's helpful. The upshot of the matter is that change is hard, and change, if you don't actually, put some thought and some effort into helping people perceive, is even harder. And then, all right, I'm going to wrap up. Here's the last question, and there's a few others. I'll try to answer these in the future, or kind of going through other processes. Somebody asked the question of whether my hair color is real. So, well, what the hell, we might as well. Yes, this is pretty much what I was born with. Redheads do this thing where they turn brown as they get older, as opposed to, I've got gray, but it's not as much as a lot of people my age do. And yeah, this is what the good Lord gave me. I've always been scared to color it. I've actually never colored my hair, which completely freaked out a colleague of mine at one point who thought that every woman on the planet had colored her hair. But no. So what you see is what you get, I guess. So thanks for taking the time with me today. These Ask Me Anythings are typically a benefit of membership in the Wise Economy Substack. So Wise Economy Substack is available very inexpensively. It gets you access to literally the ability to ask anything, in addition to a weekly digest that will be coming out either later today or tomorrow, that focuses on news that you might have missed, and kind of helping you see how that news fits in with some of these macro trends that we're describing. So that's available to people who subscribe to the Substack, as is the Accelerate Us journal that'll be coming out at the beginning of June, focusing on new networks, and there's some other benefits that come with the Substack as well. So if you want to have the ability to sort of be thinking about the future in your community, join me over there at wiseeconomy.substack.com. For other information, for books, publications, and the like, check out wiseeconomy.com, wisefulbooks.com, and the most recent book, which is The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived. You can find that at localeconomyrevolutionbook.com. So wiseeconomy.com, wisefulpressbooks.com, and localeconomyrevolutionbook.com. So thanks for taking the time to join me today, and we'll do this again next month. Take care.